Okay, so what I want to talk about tonight is again conversion, but I want to contextualize it. Last week I talked about conversion in the context of external metaphors, right, immigration policy as the organizing metaphor. Tonight we're going to talk about conversion in the context of internal metaphors and of the actual ritual process that is involved in conversion. So let's start out with the theoretical components. So there is a fundamental, the two fundamental issues that have to be addressed in conversion are what is when conversion is a change. So what exactly is the change that we are seeking, right? That we are seeking to look for. Whether, right, as always, there's always going to be a question whether conversion is about fundamentally the discovery of a change that has already taken place, and the actual ritual of conversion is simply a ratification of that change, or whether conversion itself actually affects a change, and there's actually something different about a person after than before. So the two basic axes we have, one is to what extent is conversion an issue of religion as opposed to an issue of nationality? Meaning, does one convert to Judaism or does one convert to Jewishness? And the second question is the extent, which is related but not with any absolutely necessary straight lines, is to what extent conversion is a phenomenon about what one becomes as an individual, and to what extent conversion is about the transformation of identity. Okay, so those are two fundamental questions you have to ask. And each of these positions has both extreme advocates of one side or the other, and usually the mainstream consensus tries to find one way or another of combining them. My own theory we'll talk about later. I have a particular bias, but you should be aware that conversion can be understood in any of those ways. And then, of course, the point is that while you have all these conceptual models, the law develops, as law generally does, through some kind of conversation and negotiation among various conceptual positions. So the law will end up there are aspects of the ritual that will seem like one side, and aspects of the ritual seem like the other, and one has to be cautious about claiming that you can interpret the entire conversion process in terms of one of those models. Although we'll talk about perhaps my own theory has a very clear halachic nafkamina, which we can talk about. Okay, a second way of thinking about conversion, as opposed to these abstractions, is to think of them in terms of biblical models. And there are a number of biblical models of conversion, but generally, we take two of them as representing ideal models, as opposed to most of the rest, which we use mostly as talking about the ways in which you might allow conversion, even if it weren't ideal. So the two ideal models we take are Ruth and the dialogue between Ruth and Naomi in the first chapter of the book of Ruth, and secondly, we conceptualize the experience of the Jewish people from the moment that Moses shows up in Egypt as the Redeemer, until at the very least the moment when they have the revelation at Sinai, and possibly sometime after. We consider that to some extent to be the conversion of the Jewish people as a whole. Right, so those are the two models we have. Each of those models has their own dangers in terms of conversion. Ruth, we talked about on Shavuot, right? It's hard to say that Ruth is converting at that moment, because she's converting at that moment. That means she wasn't really married to Naomi's sons. If she wasn't really married to Naomi's sons, then she's not really related to Naomi, and the whole plot goes blooey, because the whole plot rests on levirate marriage, which requires relationship, and the entire narrative of the Torah doesn't seem to presume that it's just a random group that was taken out of Egypt, and anyone who would in any group with no prior history who had gone through that experience would have all of a sudden become the Jews. So in each case, the notion that conversion doesn't, at the very least, the conversion recorded in the text there doesn't seem to be what might call a conversion ex nihilo. Right? We're turning nothing into something. There has to be some kind of prior background for the conversion. One way in which you can distinguish between using the models of Ruth and the models of Sinai is that the model of Ruth is an almost exclusively substantive model. Right? What happens in Ruth's conversion is a conversation, and all that happens is words and tears. Tears, I think, we have generally taken, although they are in practice, it's very, very hard to have a conversion process that doesn't involve tears. Nobody, to my knowledge, has ritualized the tears and said that they are an essential element. There is a conversation like that about circumcision. The conversation about whether you allow local anesthetic is the thought, right? It involves a conversation whether pain is an essential element of circumcision. We generally decide not. But to my knowledge, no one has ritualized emotional pain as an element of conversion, although it's hard to have a process which doesn't involve it. So, right, you can also, and this has, in the popular imagination, because the dialogue between Ruth and Naomi involves 3 attempts by Naomi to dissuade Ruth from leaving, so that became a model that you should discourage converts 3 times. But that, I think, well, it's probably the most well-known aspect of the conversion process. It's not actually law, and it's one of those laws that, being known, loses its entire impact. Everyone, oh, that's the first time. Will you say no again now? Sure, I'll say no again. Yes, no, right. Go away, okay. Go away, okay. Knock, knock. Oh, it's the 4th time. Yay. So this is not a very useful ritualization of the model of Ruth. Although, if one believes that discouragement is an essential element of conversion for one reason or another, so there are ways in which you can accomplish the same thing. For example, you can assign really, really long and boring books. I'm very good at that. I often assign long and boring books. And that usually doesn't take 3 books to discourage people. Really, the first book is quite sufficient. Okay, so the model of Ruth is a substantive model, and I'm really, to a large extent, not going to talk about that today. You can all read the book of Ruth and find out exactly what the substance is. The substance of the kinds of questions we ask converts and the kinds of expectations we have of them has evolved quite dramatically. And while you can always root the results back in the text, which has happily it has very specific examples which you can then abstract in all sorts of ways. Ruth says nicely, right? She says, your people are my people, and your God is my God. Okay, so now we have, now we can require both the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, Pledge of Allegiance covers both, I guess, or some equivalent, or we can, require one to get a PhD in medieval theology, because when you say, if you wanted to say in Maimonides, your God is my God, that takes a really, really long time to understand what Maimonides means by God. We might force people to choose exactly which God. Maimonides' God or Gersonides' God. We don't talk to each other much. There's a lot of leeway in the extent to which the extent of the specificity to which you demand of that. Not to mention what means your people is my people. And then then the Talmud and Eshvan Halach coming up with specific halachic content for the where you go, I will go. So that so in one medrash that means that that I won't go to movies anymore. That has some problems for modern Orthodoxy. It's necessarily opposed to movies. We have to say no, we don't go to that kind of movie. Right? Then we have to specify exactly what rating is it the movie that we don't go to, and such forth. So really, there's a lot of leeway to get from the story to the halakha, and one to understand how different communities might interpret it differently. Yes, no, not a question. Okay, so I'm not going to try tonight to take you from the story of Ruth to very, very detailed accounts of the questions that we ask. What I do want to focus on more is using Sinai as a model. So I want to take you through exactly what all the processes that we can see as the ritual processes by which the Israelites become the Jews, whatever you want, whatever term you want to use. But you have that, or you have the moment that's sort of concretized in the process that's begun in the opening verses of the book of Exodus, where in the first verse it uses the phrase Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, and it means the sons of Yaakov. And I think Rabbi Nachman Levine was here yesterday for making this point more sharp than I'd seen before. And then it says, and all the children of Israel died, that Yosef and all his brothers died. And then it says, and the children of Israel multiplied. So you have it says an obvious transition between the children of Israel meaning individuals and the children of Israel meaning some kind of larger group. Because all the people who were the children of Israel die before you use the term the second time. So the book of Exodus begins with a transition from one kind of group to another, and somewhere along the line that transition acquires specific content, which we then take as a model for conversion. So what are the ways in which ritually the family of Jacob becomes the Jewish people? So one thing you have in Exodus 12, 48, 49, this is on the first page. It says, "V'chiaguri techa ger, should a ger live among you?" Now we're going to have to point out that the Torah uses the word ger in ways which are, from a halachic perspective, unpredictable as to whether it means an alien with a green card, a naturalized citizen, or somebody who aspires to one or the other. So whenever you see the word ger in Torah, you have to know that it has at least three possibilities, which is somebody with a green card, somebody with a naturalized citizen, somebody applying for naturalized citizenship, and you never can predict which one it means where. Here it seems to mean somebody in the process of applying for citizenship. So should such a ger live among you and wish to bring the Passover sacrifice together with all the citizens, the first thing is that we require the males to be sacrificed and then to be circumcised. Sorry, not that. Professor John Levinson would love that, right? Because they think it's all sublimated, right? Everything in Judaism is a sublimated Akedah. But all sacrifice is sublimated human sacrifice. Very cool. But we'll leave it as circumcision. And then, although it's kind of fun, right, because we say, right, that he has to circumcise every male, az yikrav lasoto. And yikrav is to draw near or to be sacrificed, so you have that. And then you become as an actual citizen. So one component seems to be that circumcision was required, at least of those people who were not born children of Jacob, and it's an easy step to say that's because all the natural born citizens had already been circumcised. We didn't have to tell them about that. And in fact, in the Midrash you have some kind of mass circumcision of everybody taking place at this time. So first thing, it seems reasonable to argue that there is a requirement of circumcision. Then we move on 7 chapters later. We're in chapter 19. So God says to Moshe, "Go to the people, v'kidashtam hayom machar, and sanctify them today and tomorrow." Now, how do you sanctify people? Good question. Don't really know. But apparently sanctification is one of these processes that takes place along the way. V'chibsu sim lotam, they also have to wash their clothing. And they have to be prepared, they have to be prepared for day 3. And in fact, Moshe goes down to the mountain, he sanctifies the people, whatever that means, and they wash their clothing, and he tells them, be prepared for the 3rd day, and the rabbis pick up that perhaps be prepared on the 3rd day, and be prepared for 3 days. 3 days means that Moses added a day in. That's one of the early human contributions to the content of the Torah. And he adds in a prohibition against sexual relations, which rabbinically is, although it's framed in the masculine as men should not approach women, rabbinically it's understood as for the purpose of the women as opposed to for the purpose of the men. Because the presumption is that sexual relations have a longer impact in terms of the laws of Tum'ah on women than men, and the 3-day period is necessary to allow women to be standing at Sinai in order to receive the Torah, so that there is no need to stand again at Sinai. You were there the first time. Sorry, that was playing off a particular book. If those of you know it, know it. If those of you don't, don't. So now we have, what are the rituals involved? There's circumcision. there is some unknown ritual of sanctification, there's clothes washing, there is some limited period of abstinence or celibacy. Okay, then we go on to Exodus 24. In Exodus 24, we discover that Moshe sends the young people of Israel. They bring sacrifices. This time, really is sacrifices. He takes the book of the covenant. He reads it to the people, and then he throws the blood. And then he throws the blood on the people. Okay, so obviously the ritual of conversion should involve circumcision, sanctification, clothes washing, a period of celibacy, and then throwing blood on people. Not actually what happens. It's a really interesting question how we use this, how we use this as a model. And it actually gets even a little bit. Well, actually, let's take a look at the way in which the rabbis got from this narrative to what they actually require in the conversion process. If you take a look at page 2, the Talmud in Yevamot, page 46a, says the following. We have a Breita, a text from the period of the Mishnah, but it didn't make it into the Mishnah. So a convert, meaning, again, somebody in the process of conversion, who is circumcised but not immersed, Rabbi Eliezer says such a person is in fact a convert. All you need is circumcision, because we have discovered that our forefathers, the males in the desert prior to leading up to Sinai, circumcised, but we have no record that they immersed. So all conversion requires a circumcision. What about the other way around? So if you immersed but didn't circumcise, Rabbi Shua points out quite reasonably, well then you're obviously a convert because guess what? Nobody circumcised the foremothers. So obviously, immersion is sufficient. And then the sages go along and say no, that we require both immersion and circumcision for men, but only immersion for women. Okay, the Gemara says, why don't they each derive from the other? And in the end, they decide, you know what? Actually, everybody agrees that immersion doesn't work. The question is whether circumcision alone works for men. And we have an interesting question. So why isn't that obvious? Right? That's what everyone should agree. Men circumcised and didn't immerse. Women immersed but didn't circumcise. So let's say that it's pretty clear that circumcision alone should work. So why does Rabbi Yeshua require immersion too? The answer is, well, the men also immersed. And how did he know the men immersed? We just read the text. Didn't say the men immersed. Now, he could have said that sanctification means immersion. That would have been a very reasonable thing to say, because there are places when the verb lekadesh means to wash your body, but he doesn't. He says he sprinkled the blood over them, and we know that you never sprinkle blood on people unless they immerse themselves first. And therefore we require immersion, because you couldn't have sprinkled the blood without immersion, but we don't actually require sprinkling blood. It's a little bit of a weakness. But at the end of this, we're perfectly happy saying that we require both immersion and circumcision. And we say, hang on a sec, okay, but we seem to be under the impression that the blood was only sprinkled on the men. Why we're under this impression is not clear. And based on that, on that question, so how do we know that the women immersed at all? So Rishon makes a fascinating. Rishon makes a fascinating claim. He says it's obvious, because if they didn't immerse, what did they do? Right, very dramatically, how did they enter into the under the sheltering wings of the divine presence? So that's a really interesting claim, because there's a simple answer. Yeshua could have said they entered into it by making a verbal declaration. They entered into it by having some kind of change of heart, by adopting a particular belief. But Rabbi Yeshua, the way the Talmud understands Rabbi Yeshua, he has a premise that conversion requires ritual. And so that I think is a really interesting point. And the Rechia Barabba comes along and says that the halacha is that conversion for men requires both circumcision and immersion, and for women requires immersion. Okay, this is all really very good. So now we understand, and particularly we understand why it is that women have to immerse, because they have to do something, and otherwise they wouldn't have to do anything. Which is really interesting, because if we now go to the next page, we look at Bamidbar Tet-Vav-Yidal Tet-Zayin, Numbers chapter 15, verses 14 through 16. So it says, once again, if you have a ger living among you, or those who are with you in your generations, and he makes some kind of burnt offering to God, whatever you do, so too the convert shall do. The congregation, there's one statute for all of you, and for the ger, an eternal law for your generations, like you, like a convert, and we go on like this for a while. Okay, so it's all very nice, but now we discover that in the Mishnah in Kritut 8b, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov takes the position that converts are considered to be in the legal status of mechusar kapara, meaning that they have not completed their ritual obligations such as to allow them the full privileges of the community until they have brought a sacrifice. And the Gemara goes on and says, what do we mean that they're not? What do we mean that they haven't completed the ritual obligations? They're not really members of the community until they bring sacrifices. And at that point, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi comes in and he learns from this verse, like you, like a convert, that converts have to convert the same way you did. Just like you, the Jewish people, converted through circumcision, immersion, and some kind of blood ritual, so too all future converts have to convert involving circumcision, immersion, and some kind of blood ritual, which is now interpreted not as the sprinkling of blood, but rather the bringing of a sacrifice. So now we know that, right? So now we know that conversion actually requires circumcision, immersion, and sacrifice. And all this is because we have to do exactly what the Jews did at Sinai. Even though, so far as we can tell, there's no record in the text that they immersed, and the blood ritual wasn't sacrificed. Here the Talmud points out a problem. No temple. Converts? Uh-oh. So Talmud says, right, so if you look at the next paragraph, Elamayata, but now, Ha'idna, nowadays, when there's no sacrifice, Lo Nikabel Gerim. We should not accept converts. So Rabbi Yaakov says, V'chi agur itchem ger asher b'tochachem, etc. So this is one of those tricky things where it's generally understood that the etc. is what really matters. Because they cite the beginning of the verse and they don't quote the continuation. Actually, the key line is the continuation. So the key line seems to be they learn the word in your generations as meaning that conversion has to be possible in all generations. And therefore, even though conversion is supposed to be like Sinai, meaning circumcision, immersion, and sacrifice, no temple, no sacrifice, we're fine. So that's a really interesting thing, Rich, because now what happened to the model? So there seems to be a value that overrides the model. And the value that overrides the model is that one has to be always open to the acceptance of converts. That's a really interesting claim. So where does that come from? Yes, Dave.
Well, you start the premise of the transition from Bnei Yisrael, Bnei Yaakov.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're a family, you can't convert into a family, right? Because you're a member of the family or you're not.
Mm-hmm.
So far in all the ritual aspects, we haven't really explored even why would you? It's only logical that you would ever allow a ger, right? If you're family, either you're in or you're out.
Excellent. So that's really a big challenge. The contemporary Orthodox philosopher Michael Wishagra takes the position that conversion is a miracle. Because it shouldn't be possible. You become a member of the family, and but on the other hand, adoption happens. We don't usually think of adoption as a miracle. So that's but Wishagra does make the claim that dramatically that conversion is a miracle. I'm going to take a different perspective in about 5 minutes. Okay, so what happens halachically to this requirement that conversion has to be possible in all generations? So if you take a look at page 4, So on page 4, the Tosafos asked the question that it seems clear from the Talmud that the court that is necessary for conversion, and I haven't mentioned a court, but the Talmud says that all conversions require courts. We're going to just leave that then a miracle occurs and we demonstrate that conversion requires courts for now. So the Talmud says all conversion require courts, and not just courts. They require courts called mumchin, who are experts. And expert is defined by the Talmud here not as degree of knowledge, but as having achieved a particular rank, the rank that used to be called smicha. Right, brief excursus for those of you who know, those of you who don't know. Right, what we call smicha nowadays is not actually what was classically called smicha. Right, classical smicha was literally a laying on of hands, which was a direct succession from Moses laying his hands on the original 70 elders, and that smicha ends sometime during the Talmudic period. It's a really interesting phenomenon as to why and how, because we have a heroic narrative in the Talmud, Yehuda ben Bava, who gives up his life right, when the Romans are trying to wipe out smicha, and he stands in a narrow path and gives smicha to his students, and then has them all run away, and he holds the pass while being riddled with arrows. So at the end, he looks like a sieve. And that's how he saves smicha, but a couple hundred years later, it dies out anyway. So what we call real smicha ends sometime before the medieval period, and is replaced by by a certificate that gives you the right to rule the lifetime of your teacher, which is what we have nowadays. And a lot of the confusion about, in terms of gender and smicha, is based on the question of how seriously we take the connection between the original word and the contemporary practice, even though halachically they're not really connected. I mean, they're historically connected. One of them is sort of an emanation of the other, or an imitation of the other. Any case, so we don't have real smicha nowadays, right? It ends. And the Talmud seems to indicate that judges for conversion, all the judges have to be people who have this form of smicha. So conversion, once again, should be impossible. So Tosfot give two answers, which eventually become combined. One answer is that, well, we already learned that we gave up the sacrifice because conversion has to be possible in all generations, so we'll just give up the experts. Because this overriding principle, you can never create a circumstance in which it is practically impossible to accept converts. Second answer is that part of the reason that smicha died out, perhaps it's a post-facto reaction, is that we developed a really cool theory, which is that the last people with smicha, before they died, empowered their rabbinic successors to do everything that they could do as their agents. So they legislated themselves into obsolescence by transferring their powers to unordained successors. There are all sorts of problems with this theory. Normally, dead people can't have agents halachically, because normally we treat the agent as acting, as doing something that the person, if they were here, would do, and if the person isn't here, then they can't do it. But we're going to work within this mechanism. Okay, so that's right. So now we have this halachic. Right, so we have the clear halachic requirement is that conversion requires circumcision, immersion, and sacrifice. Some or all of which somehow has to take place in the presence of a rabbinic court, but we've gotten rid of the sacrifice, we've gotten rid of the rabbinic court, or at least of that kind of rabbinic court. And now we have one last thing that happened at Sinai. The Talmud in any number of places, I gave you one of the instances. If we turn back to page 3, the Talmud says addresses the question in a number of places about the validity of an oath to do something that the Torah already requires you to do. Right? If I swear that I will not plow on Shabbat, or harvest on Shabbat, whatever it may be. So the Talmud consistently says, no, that won't work, because we have a general halachic rule that redundant oaths don't take effect. And what we mean, and everyone is already sworn at Sinai to uphold, right? All Jews already sworn at Sinai to uphold the Torah. So now we have another element of the experience at Sinai, which is that everybody apparently took an oath. And that also is not part of the conversion process. Finally, and perhaps we don't have any hints, we don't have that moment of the oath, So we also don't know what the content of it is, but it can often be identified with the moment when the Jews, when Moses conveys what God wants to the Jews, and they say, Kol ma, right, everything that God says, na'aseh v'nishma. And in that case, the rabbis, which is not usually the case, the rabbis are usually very sensitive to Shema, meaning heed as opposed to hear. But in this particular case, the rabbis say that na'aseh v'nishma means we will do it, and afterwards we'll find out what it is. So it's right. So to some degree, it's a blind. So if you take that statement as the epitome of conversion, that means that conversion, right? So now we have a process of conversion, which is circumcision. The original conversion is circumcision, some kind of unknown sanctification ritual, washing clothing, having blood sprinkled on you, and saying the words na'aseh v'nishma. But we have now, right? We have now turned that into circumcision, immersion, sacrifices which become optional when no longer possible, involvement of a court, we don't know from where, and that's it. Nonetheless, it seems to me that this has to be the right model. But I'm just leaving it to you that it's really, really, really hard to figure out exactly how we get from point A to point B. Why don't we at least require people to wash their clothes? It says so in the verse. Yeah, you don't like the blood, okay. But what's wrong with washing clothing? Really, really hard to figure out what happened to washing clothing. Except that washing clothing just doesn't seem to have been one of those rituals that went on anywhere outside the temple in Judaism. It's really interesting. Okay, I want to give you one cool example of intellectual. Well, actually, no. Let's point out one. Right. Let's point out one more thing. So we noted that that one of the things that drives the halachot of conversion as we have them today is the absolute necessity of accepting converts in all generations, the Gerut Process. So in contrast to that, you have to look at the second source on page 4, which says, we won't accept converts in Messianic times. And by the way, they also didn't accept any converts in the times of David and the time of Solomon. So we have to figure out how this plays, right? So if you try and put all these texts together in a unified way, if we were just doing a text-based shiur, we'd have to point out that we have one text which says that obviously immersion is necessary because otherwise women have no ritual, and another text which says that you have to bring sacrifices. And we have one text which says that conversion has to be possible in all generations, and another text which says that there were 2 generations in which they didn't accept converts, as well as they won't accept converts in Messianic times. So when we talk, right, so constructing a contemporary halakha conversion requires you to try and find some way of balancing these and recognizing that there isn't necessarily going to be a clear way of saying that we account for all precedent. Okay, so I'm going to just put in two intellectual things. One, really, I say, is a cool example of what I would call intellectual judo, which is when you use someone's argument against them, and another, which a philosophic point, which I think is really valuable. The intellectual point is as follows. So we just said that conversion has to be possible in all generations. And the way in which we make that possible is by saying, right, we even go to this wild extreme where we say that when we convert people nowadays, we're doing so as the agents of people in the past. Right? It's one of the powers that the Smuchim gave to their successors because it had to be. You couldn't allow there to be a time in which we didn't accept converts. They have another text which we talked about last week, which says that fundamentally all judgments of the motivations of converts are up to the subjective perception of the supervising court, and that even though there is a list of motivations which are taken as sub-ideal, and we can see that text directly. I don't think I gave it to you. I didn't give it to you this week, but there's a list of suboptimal motivations. Conversion for the sake of marriage, conversion for the sake of money, conversion for the sake of security, all those sorts of things. But nonetheless, the halakha is that regardless of the motivation, if the commitment is sincere, the conversion is valid. So Untitled Chapter is a marvelous thing, which he said, okay, that's right, that's true that conversion in theory is valid, right, no matter what the initial motivation. But if we classify such conversions as b'diavad, meaning that they're post facto valid, but we would not have done them if the question were asked in advance. And somebody goes ahead and does a conversion which we think they should not have done in advance, well, we can make the argument, you know what? It's true that if the original smuchim had done such a conversion, it would have been valid. But they would never have given the power to other people to do conversions that they would not have done. Therefore, Rav Schachter makes the argument that only ideal conversions can happen nowadays. Because all conversions here take place under the doctrine of agency, and agency does not include discretion. It's a really interesting argument. I don't think he means it halachically. I don't think anyone accepts it halachically. I think it's mostly a way of showing that if you didn't think of that, you don't know enough about conversion to be involved in the conversation. And it's a point. It's a really good argument. People should think of it. But now I have made you all members of the conversation. The argument that I think has perhaps somewhat more ramification in practice at the second stage is there's an article by Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. I don't know how many of you know Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky was. He is the subject of perhaps the most notorious biography of modern Orthodox literature. But he was the head of Yeshivat Torah Vodaas, and really a very, very interesting figure, noteworthy among other things for his concern for the dignity of all human beings. And he has in the records, and I should be careful, right? There is in the back of his commentary on the Talmud Nashim and Nizikin, there are the oral recollections of his Shabbat afternoon lectures as recorded by his students. So you always have to wonder, right, exactly how accurate they are. But in one of them, which I love, he makes the argument that conversion is philosophically necessary because if conversion weren't possible, we would be racists. And he goes, he uses the gizanut, which is racism, and he draws the explicit hyperbolic analogy to Nazism. And so his philosophic understanding, I think, right, understanding why the possibility of conversion is necessary in all generations, is precisely, to take what David's point was earlier, is that we don't want to make the claim that Judaism is fundamentally a biological category. And so we always have to make explicit that conversion is possible in order to come up with some definition of Judaism which is not purely biological. Right? It has to account for the reality that people who are born Jews are Jews, but that, I think, reasonably, he thinks is not so much more difficult than that the children of United States citizens are citizens. Right? That's not taken as a racial claim about the composition of the United States. Right? It's a necessity of political theory that the children have to be bound by their parents' commitments. So I think that's a very powerful argument. There are other arguments which you can say about it. You took the position we saw last year that says that really maybe the whole purpose of exile is to allow us to include converts, to benefit, you might say, from cultural diversity, and that would be a different reason. So it always has to be possible, and that might even explain why specifically it's in the Messianic era in the times of David and Solomon, when we weren't in exile in any significant sense, that we don't necessarily have to accept converts. All sorts of ways which you can construct it. Okay, third level, I'll just say for my own I guess contribution in a sense, or the way that I function, is that I think the way I understand the recreation of the Sinai experience is built around the absence of the oath. Why don't we make converts take an oath? So my argument is that if converts take an oath, what they then have is a personal obligation to keep the Torah. We don't want them to take an oath. We want them to be bound by the oath that the Jews took at Sinai, just the way the rest of us are. Right. So the point is not to experience the same. Right. It's not. Right. It's to integrate yourself, become a cell in the body. Right. So I think it's actually very important that we don't require a personal oath from the convert, because fundamentally there is a difference between a personal obligation that is self-assumed and an obligation that falls upon you because of an identification. That might also, if we're in a polemical context, point out that there was a famous argument made by Rabbi Joel Roth some years ago that when she argued that women who took a personal oath to keep time-bound commandments would then be commanded in the same way as men and could then fulfill their obligations, and to me, that was a fundamental category error, which really misunderstood the whole nature of obligation and of interrelated obligations, and the capacity to fulfill somebody else's obligation, which is precisely not because you personally are obligated, but because you are collectively obligated. So an obligation that you take, that is self-imposed will never have the same, will never fit into the same conceptual scheme as an obligation that is naturally imposed. And aside from that, he also missed a lot of Gemaras. But that's a separate issue. Which explicitly, it was just not a good argument. Clever, but not good. Okay, so that's right. So my understanding is that the best way to use the Sinai experience is not you have to go through the same things we did, but you go through a ritual, right? A ritual reenactment of them, so that it is as if you were there. Okay, now we can go on. Right, so that's the end of stage one of the presentation. Now I want to talk about what actually happens. And here, so we mentioned in previous weeks, I'm going to talk about what actually happens, or what is actually supposed to happen in the process of our Beitin, with the caveat that what we do is not necessarily the only halachic way, that we don't always live up to our own standards, although we try, and that in certain cases, I can't give away trade secrets. Okay, but normally, the first thing that we require converts to do is to find a sponsor. And there again, so we don't require the formal discouraging, but we presume that first of all, most rabbis don't have so much spare time, and they'll be discouraging. And secondly, there are lots of ways of discouraging. I say my usual example is long, boring books. But they're all, require people to do other things. But some rabbis go through the formal not go away, not go away, not go away, and we don't do that. Also, there are a number of categories of people whom perhaps everyone agrees we shouldn't discourage, which we'll talk about later. People who were born into a Jewish identity. People who were born into a Jewish identity and have lived as Orthodox Jews their entire lives, and then discover at some later point that they were adopted and never converted or something like that. So in such cases, I think there's an utter consensus that you don't feel a need to go through the Naomi and Ruth thing and send them away repeatedly, because you really don't want the sister to go away. Right? We want to keep Arpa too. Yes.
When you have someone whose father is Jewish and mother isn't.
Yeah.
And so that they maybe, let's say they grew up in a favorite form synagogue and
Yeah.
they were treated as Jews, would they discourage that kind of person or not?
So I wouldn't want, if there is a spectrum of opinions on our court. Generally, if the only identity someone had previously was Jewish, then we don't see a purpose in discouraging. I think that would be the way to formulate it. But if you're patrilineal, but you grew up in a multi-faith home, right, then it's not quite as clear.
So would you require the person, you would still require them to be Orthodox or not?
Yeah, it doesn't change. The only thing it changes for us really is the process, is the stage at which you enter into the process. It doesn't change the outcome. We can talk about that. We can talk about that a little bit as we go on, but fundamentally, it doesn't change the outcome for us. Okay, so now finding a sponsor is actually not such not a meaningless endeavor. Yes.
Does the sponsor have to be a rabbi?
The sponsor does not formally have to be a rabbi, but the sponsor has to be capable of, for our Beit, actually the sponsor is the most important relationship you build. Because, let's say, best case scenario, let's suppose that we are we have lots and lots of time, and we do the process really, really well, everything's coordinated really well, and it's this process where the person enters at the very beginning of their process, and we do a really rigorous 2-year, 3-year process, and we see you once every 4 months during that time. We interview for an hour and a half each time. So now we've interviewed 6 times for an hour and a half. We've met you for 9 hours. Not so easy to know a person's soul in 9 hours. especially 9 hours of artificial situations in which you're playing the interview game, right? So really, so even if you're a really good interviewer, you're not really going to know everything about somebody. So the way our Beitin works is that A, the sponsor has primary educational responsibility for the convert, so you have to be somebody who can do that. B, the sponsor has the sponsor is the conduit for the Beitin, where really what we do is we check the sponsor's impression for them, and we ask the hard questions to the sponsor to make sure they can answer them. But really, fundamentally, we acknowledge that it's really the sponsor who's going to know the person's soul well, and that means that we have to have a working relationship with the sponsor. And it's much easier to find a working relationship with somebody who've worked with all along. That said, we are aware that in our universe, Rabbi means male, and conversion candidates are often not male. So we try very, very hard to make sure that with women conversion candidates, that whoever is the sponsor, really it's a couple that functions that way, and usually, primarily it is the wife, who generally is a professional Jewish educator in her own right, who is the real sponsor. And you have to make sure we're very clear that we don't really want rabbis sponsoring female candidates to know the candidate better than their wife knows the candidate. You have the last thing is that we will ask the sponsor at the end, that's one of the questions we ask, is are you ready to take on lifetime responsibility for this person? Because we don't think that people should come into the community without having a permanent support mechanism. So there again, not so many people who don't see it as part of their job are willing to take on that role. But really don't want it to be a process where you get someone to the gate and then you just abandon them. It doesn't seem like a proper thing to do. The Gemara talks about the necessity of picking the right sponsor, and that's actually an art. It's a really big issue that we have in the Chabad community, that we don't have enough rabbis who are willing to take on conversion candidates, and trying to figure out how we expand the pool beyond rabbis. Right? Therefore, and certainly beyond synagogue rabbis is a big issue, since we have rabbis of several major synagogues who won't take conversion candidates. Gemara says that tells 3 stories of converts who came to Shammai, and Shammai kicks them out, and they come to Hillel, and Hillel brings them in, and then later they meet, and they say, Shammai would have kept us, would have kept us out of all this glorious experience, and Hillel brought us in. So it makes a really big difference whether you find a convert, whether you find a sponsor you relate to or a sponsor you don't relate to. Actually, sponsor candidate shidduch making is something that really is an art, and it would be better if we had a broader pool. But our Beitin makes it as a policy that we don't pay sponsors. We really don't like the formal sponsor being paid for teaching, although we understand that often the conversion candidate is going to have to hire someone to teach them, and often that ends up. But we try and find some way to make sure that the sponsor doesn't have a financial interest in the conversion. But the downside of that is that no one has a self-interested motive in the conversion. So we're still trying. Some Beit Din are very proud of the way in which they've instituted formal payment for sponsors, which they think professionalizes. We're much more on the other side. Israel is very much professionalized, and I have to say that some of the stories I read are terrifying, really quite terrifying. So I'm happier with our system for now, but it just realizes that it has its downsides. It has its downsides as well. We have a second thing. It's realizing that Gemara has a story. In addition to those, it has a story of Timnah, who ends up becoming the mother of Amalek because she gets turned down as a conversion candidate. So you really don't. That's really creating Amalek. That's a bad thing. So I think that our general principle is that we don't send people away at the outset unless it's just really, really hopeless. And in general, really the only thing our Beit Din will send you away for, as opposed to just say, what, you're not ready and we're never going to tell you when, we can't tell you when you'll be ready, and that happens. But to say, go away, we don't want to see you again, mostly, really the way that happens is dishonesty. Somebody is dishonest with us, so then we have no relationship with them. Go somewhere else, but we can't deal with it. But short of dishonesty, we'll just tell you, right now we're not going anywhere. Come back when something changes. Okay, so really the way in which we prefer to have the process begin is that somebody finds a sponsor and the sponsor really understands what kind of commitment they're making. And I want to really emphasize how this is something that really requires a great deal of understanding. I will say this, as a sort of just an important point to realize for the community. I know that there is often a big issue in communities that rabbis take on conversion candidates, and conversion candidacies take up a lot of time. So it really has to be, right? So for a rabbi to do it really requires the community to be supportive of this as a value, and not to feel jealous. Why is the rabbi spending so much time with the converts? Because conversion candidates will take more time than the average congregant. They have many, many more questions. They need much more support socially, and that's really an issue that we as a community have to figure out how we build that into. Either we make it a separate profession, which, as I say, I find not really a good thing. And when you professionalize it, let's say the conservative community in the Boston area has a formal course, and you graduate and you get converted. And I don't think we want to move it in that direction. But at the same time, we have to find time, and we have to find manpower. So our ideal version is the first thing you do is find a sponsor. Unfortunately, and really it's the obligation of the convert to convince somebody who is a potential sponsor of their, that it's worth their investment. And both sides, again, the other thing you have to understand is that investing in a conversion candidate is a tremendous emotional commitment. And at the same stage, part of your job is to make sure that nobody ends up converting because they feel they owe you because you put so much effort into it. Mentoring conversion candidates is often a heartbreaking experience because you can take people a long, long way, and at the end they correctly decide, but this isn't for me. And then you could have spent 10 hours a week for a year and a half, and at the end of it, what you have is, well, you're glad you helped someone grow up. And that's often very hard. So it's another thing that really has to be understood in trying to make this, if you want to do the process the way we do it, which is a really serious, psychologically intense process, there are real costs that are often borne by the sponsor, and that some have to be amortized across the community. Okay. Sometimes, most of the time it works fairly well that the candidate finds a sponsor on their own. If it's a synagogue rabbi, that usually means that they have to move to the community. Too often in Boston that doesn't happen on their own, and so we end up running first interviews with candidates who don't have sponsors, in which really our major goal is to find some way in which possibly somebody would be willing to take them on as a candidate. Once you have a sponsor, so the next stage is filling out an application. It's quite a long application. I don't know, I think it's like 10 pages or something. So that's even if you don't attach additional pages for the essays. Really quite a good application in our case, a little bit dated, but quite a good application which asks all sorts of serious questions, philosophic questions in addition to basic history. Some of the things that we look for are, for example, whether someone is special needle, whether they were raised as a Jew, if they had a different religious identity, to what extent have they abandoned that religious identity as opposed to come up with some version of syncretism or supersessionism, or things like that. Right? So those are questions of halachic impact. We want to really understand them as overall human beings. I think because it's Rabbi Soloveitchik's Beit, so we ask for their Weltanschauung. And we require proper pronunciation of German, unlike the judges. Everyone has to listen to many tapes of Rabbi Soloveitchik saying Weltanschauung, and willy-nilly, repeatedly, until they really know. But I think it's actually a big deal. I'll quote my father-in-law sent me before sometime earlier this year an unpublished manuscript from my wife's great-grandfather, I think. It was really interesting. Hoping we'll get it published. And one of the things he says there is that when Hillel says, what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others, all the rest is commentary, go learn. Well, really, how is not wearing shatnez commentary on do not do unto others, we don't have others do unto you? And so his answer is no. When people come to convert, we assume that they really like the ritual. We don't have to worry about that. What we have to worry about is whether they'll be nice people. Because you can assume that people who come to convert are not converting because they hate ritual. It's a really strange religion to convert to, if you're right, if you dislike ritual. But unfortunately, it's possible to fit in reasonably well in the community sometimes, even if you're not a nice person. So it's really a big part of finding out is whether people are nice people. That's really, it's an interesting challenge. Like, what would happen if at the end of the day we say, you know what, we think you'll be a really ritually observant person, but our sense is that you too often you say nasty things about people, so go away. Right? That's really an interesting challenge. And how do you know that? We'll talk about at some point. I gave you the sheet that although there is a Talmudic text which says that the converts have to accept every word of Torah, and then the position goes from beyond Torah to every word of the tradition, every word of practice, etc. And if you accept it excluding one thing, then you're excluded. So, but that cannot mean that you are making an absolute commitment that you'll never violate anything, because it's really, really hard never to say Lashon Hara. And to say that a convert has to absolutely convince us that they will never ever commit any sins, that would be extreme. But nonetheless, I think it's reasonable to say that we should be looking for